Qian Julie, welcome.
I'm so glad to be here with you, Liz.
I am so honored to be talking to you right now in person, in real life. For everyone who's watching, we have spoken before, but we've never met in person. And I would like to begin with what I hope is a simple question. Beautiful Country is dedicated, the dedication reads like this: for all those who remain in the shadows, may you one day have no reason to fear the light. And I wanted to start by asking you why you chose that as your dedication for your very first book, of many, I hope, and to talk a little bit about your thoughts behind it.
The meaning has actually shifted over the course of months. Initially, I meant for the dedication to address the undocumented Americans out there who have to hide in invisibility and cannot speak up and stand up for their rights and their humanity. But over time, I've come to see that that message actually applies to a greater swath of the American population, including Asian Americans, who are often not heard or seen in our national discourse and media. And then I started thinking that probably all of us have these secrets and shames that we harbor about ourselves and our lives. And what freedom and privilege it is for me to be able to air those secrets out and reclaim my power from that shame. And I would wish that for every single person out there.
If there is someone watching us right now who has not read Beautiful Country yet, unfortunately for them, how would you describe it?
I would describe it as a literary memoir retracing my life, specifically from age 7 to 12. And I wanted to focus in on those years because there's something so foundational and seminal about those years of childhood. There is a common thread of universality at those ages where we're all just kind of wandering around and bumping into things and making mistakes and being so vulnerable with our hearts on our sleeves and learning that over time some things are not safe, some things are safe. Learning to guard ourselves and maybe hide a part of who we are. And above and beyond that, I also wanted to pay tribute to the early immigrant experience. So during those years, my family and I lived in New York City as undocumented immigrants, newly moved here from Beijing, outside of Beijing in China. And I wanted to really celebrate the joy and strength and humanity and fears too of that experience and give light to an existence that's rarely talked about.
What does it mean to you tonight to be sitting here in the Tenement Museum having this conversation?
The first time I came to this exhibit was actually at a group tour, and I saw this room in particular, and there's a rice station, which I write about in my book. My mother worked in a sweatshop and I accompanied her, and we got free rice every day, and that was our meal for the day. When I came upon that station, I just started crying because it feels like I'm back in my childhood in such a visceral way, and it's really what I try to recreate through my words in my book, to allow people to step into my body and walk through the sweatshop, but to actually be here in the recreation of that room affected me much more deeply than I could have imagined. And I have to say that the staff at the Tenement Museum did a remarkable job of replicating all of the details with such accuracy.
If somebody had said to you in those days when you were going to work with your mom, someday you will come back to a recreation of a place like this as an adult with a best-selling book, with a legal career, with what appears to me to be a very happy and well-rounded and comfortable adult life, what do you think your 7-year-old self would have said?
My first response would have been, "You're crazy. It's not possible." And my second response would be, "That's what my mother tells me every day." During that time when it felt like our lives flipped upside down, because my parents were professors in China, and over the course of a flight across the world, everything changed for us. My mother never failed to remind me that everything that we were going through was temporary, and even if they somehow could not make it out, that I would. And she was able to frame it for me as such, and as such I had hope of making it out. I never could have dreamed of this, though, this day in particular. But I thank her for instilling some of that hope in me, because she did make it possible for me to get here, as surreal as it is.
I have a double question. Do you think that your parents would describe themselves as optimists? And are you now at the age that they were when they came here with you? And do you think about that a lot?
My dad has overtly described himself as a pessimist.
Okay.
Which is so silly to me, because he is such an idealist. I mean, as much as he was leaving China, he was running toward America and everything it had come to represent to him. When he was reading banned books as a child in a dissident household and dreaming of the concept of democracy and freedom of speech. And I am actually now older than my parents were. I believe my dad first moved here when he was 29. He came here for 2 years before my mother and I joined him, and my mom was about 31. So yeah, and I turned 35 years this year, and I can't imagine even now at this age, if I were to pick up everything and just move to a different country and live without status, what that would be like, and have to learn a whole new language. Every day that passes is another day that I gain even more insight and appreciation of everything that my parents chose to take on and sacrifice so that I could be here today in this room.
Do you think there's any coincidence to the fact that you probably started working on this book around, or maybe you started percolating the idea of this book around the ages that they were when they came?
You know, I didn't even think about that until you just asked me. I had not considered
I mean, that takes guts also.
Yeah.
Tell us how a busy lawyer writes a book. And tell me about the moment. Was there a moment where you knew you needed to write this book?
Yeah. So I became a citizen in May 2016, 22 years after I first moved here. And I had convinced myself that it was not a big deal to be naturalized. Mm-hmm. I had already been a lawyer for years. I had argued in court. I had a green card for years. I just told myself being a citizen didn't matter. And when I went into that courthouse where I had argued previously, and a video of President Obama plays at the front of the room, and he says, "Greetings, fellow Americans," I just felt something unlock in me. I started bawling and I could not stop, because up until that moment, when a sitting president acknowledged me and my Americanness, I did not have the safety to recognize how badly I had wanted to be accepted, how much I love this country, and how I felt so very rejected by it at every turn. And as I exited the courthouse, I paused at the threshold and I said, never forget this day, never take this privilege of being called American for granted. I'm proud to say that I have not. So of course, as the nation reeled into a certain election that we're all familiar with, and the discourse really took a turn, I felt that it was my privilege and responsibility to share my story of those years, because it was no longer my secret to keep. And I owed it to the many millions out there who had to struggle every day with enforced invisibility, to share a little bit of what that experience is like. And it's not to say that all undocumented people experience the same things, but I wanted to hold up the humanity and the strength and the resilience to light, so that they can see themselves reflected in one way. But of course, I was a working lawyer. I was very busy, and I had not talked about those years all of my life.
Wow.
So I sat down to write, and I didn't have the words. I had no idea where to begin, because I had bottled everything up and locked it in the basement of my heart. So I went into therapy and spent a good 2 years in therapy before I was ready to write. I'm still in therapy, don't worry. And I still found that I didn't have time. I had a book event with Charles Yu, who of course was also a lawyer when he began to write. And we both agreed that any lawyer who wants to be a writer is not of sound mind. There are not enough hours in the day. But one day I was sitting on the subway on my commute to work. And anyone who's familiar with the subway system is familiar with that time when the conductor comes on and says, "We're being held, we will be moving momentarily," which means that we will be moving anywhere from 2 minutes or in 2 hours. So I thought, I have so much to do, I have to write this book, and I have no time, and now I'm just sitting in this metal box underground. And I looked at my phone, which was in my hand, and of course I didn't have the reception to take calls or work on briefs. And I started writing from there. And it was in that sanctity of the Notes app, which felt so casual to me and intimate, that I think I was able to access these memories that were so intimate and emotional. And so I had a built-in routine every day, first thing in the morning, and then when I went home at night, where it would just be my time to revisit with my childhood self and my parents.
Do you remember the first scene or the first memory that you wrote?
I had a really hard time accessing some of the darker memories, like the scenes from the sweatshop. And when my mother worked in a sushi processing plant in ice water for hours at a time. But it was easier for me to remember my first time eating pizza and not knowing what cheese was, and having the cheese stick everywhere on my hands and on my face. So that was the first memory that I was able to pull out and put down on the page. And from there, it just became that much easier. And shopping day, which was about, of course, my parents and I kind of scavenging through the trash for furniture and goods was the next one, and that was joyful for me because I found an assortment of Polly Pockets, which never ceased to bring a smile to my face.
Mine too. I totally agree. Talk to me a little bit about the role that books and reading and words and stories played in your establishing a new home here in this country, and maybe even how they functioned as kind of a guidebook or operating instructions about how to be American.
My father was a literature professor in China, and for as long as I could remember, my father would say, books are magic, books are the key to life. And I heard it, but I didn't really understand it, and certainly didn't live it until we moved here. And the number one message that I got first day in America was, do not be caught, do not let it be known that you are a new immigrant, because then that will lead to questions about your status. And the number one way to evade notice was to fit in, and the number one way to do that was to speak perfect English. And I came here speaking no English. Like, I knew one or two words in the alphabet, and that was it. So my access to the language, first and foremost, came through the public library. My beloved branch, Chatham Square Library on East Broadway, I would go there after school. And at first it was purely practical. I had to learn English, and it was as simple as that. But indelibly, I felt myself pulled into these worlds of Clifford the Big Red Dog and Amelia Bedelia, and very quickly the Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley High. And through those books, I found it almost a replacement for the family and friends I had lost back in China, but also very much a roadmap for what it means to be a quote-unquote regular American kid. Through the lives of Claudia Kishi and Christine Thomas and Elizabeth Wakefield, I was able to learn a little bit what life might be like for me had I been living in the suburbs somewhere and had parents who weren't worried about being caught. And I learned to take on some of the trappings and understand also the joys of childhood in America, and dream about having, one day a house with a lawn and a dog.
I always think about that Margaret Atwood quote, "A word after a word after a word is power." And I really thought of it when I was reading your book, because I felt like you just built this kind of yellow brick road into your future with those stories. And that was one of the things that just drew me in and moved me incredibly. I know that you've had some teachers from your past reconnect with you since the book has come out, and the teachers in the memoir are such a strong they're such strong figures and strong voices. I would love to hear a little bit about those reconnections.
Absolutely. So I've gone back to speak at PS 124, my elementary school. I've just received another invitation this week to go back and speak to fifth graders in particular about my career. In my mind, I'm still a child, so to go speak to children is about my career is just mind-boggling. But I connected with my favorite teacher of all time.
Wow.
Miss Poon is her actual name. Miss Pong is her name in the book. I kind of tweaked it a little bit. And I was shocked because I sent her, of course, a photo of Charlotte's Web, a book that she gave me. And it was the very first book I ever had to myself in America. And of course I treasured it. And she said, "I can't believe that you kept it all of these years." And then she sends me photos of all of these cards and letters that I gave her back when I was 8 years old. And I say, "You can't believe that I kept this book. I can't believe you kept this garbage full of jokes and silly riddles and drawings that don't look like anything."
Of all the students that she had.
Of all things.
That's amazing.
And she said, "These are my treasures. My students are my children, and these are my treasures." And the very idea that she saw something in them to keep that, she saw something in me to nurture, just means the world. And looking back, I thought I had hidden a lot of the troubles of my childhood, I guess, from teachers. I thought I was a sly kid. And she said, it was very apparent to me that something was going on, but I also saw this bright light, this child who just loved words and books and reading and writing, and I wanted to nurture that. And so I think the power of being seen by any adult, it's cannot be overstated. And public school teachers around the world are our heroes, and I say this at every event. They are heroes, and they are under-recognized for all that they do.
This is one of the few books I've read where you thank, I believe, the public library and the subway system, and I can't remember if you thank the public school teachers, but I appreciate that. It makes you, I feel, a real New Yorker. Tell me what the past 6 months have been like for you. It's been 6 months since the book came out.
Yes.
And I can't even imagine what a wild ride it's been.
It feels like 6 years.
In a good way?
In a good way. I felt every emotion, I think, available to human existence. Before the book came out, I had a countdown timer on my phone, counting down to Pub Day, which is the nerdiest thing. But really, the idea undergirding that was that once we counted down, it would be done. I would be done.
Little did you know.
Slowly, I realized, I'm never done. This book is just going to be out there forever, possibly, in some form. And I've since been traveling across the country, meeting people, and the community, the sense of community I've felt, especially in rooms of Asian Americans and immigrants and undocumented Americans. I said to you previously, it feels like homecoming, but to a home that I've never known before and that I did not know was available. And every single person I have met has their own story that has touched me so much in its strength and hope and love of this country. And I have just learned so much, and I've been so inspired by every single person who's made the time to come out and spend an hour or two with me.
Is there one instance in particular that stands out to you, one audience member whose story has really, lingered on your shoulder?
There are several. I'll try to narrow it down, but there were 2 teenage boys who took the bus across town in Chicago to come meet me. And I didn't consciously write for women or girls, but because that's my experience, I just never thought of boys or men reading my book. And they had traveled across town to meet me, and I said, "Oh my God, you're 14 years old. What are you doing here?" And they say that their parents had been undocumented before they were born, and they never talk about that experience. And my book somehow gave them a window into their family story in a way that they didn't think was accessible or available to them. And those moments just mean so much, because I never come out of spending time with our nation's children and teenagers without feeling so much immense hope for the future of our country. They're just so perceptive and understand things way beyond what I understood at their age. And so that moment has stayed with me every day of this book tour.
How has your relationship with keeping secrets changed? You grew up with a lot of secrets. And the fact that you have teenagers who I know from firsthand experience can be sort of tough nuts to crack, that you have teenagers coming to you and telling you a version of their secrets, makes me curious if, I guess really what you would say to somebody who's watching right now who has a secret about their own family or their own struggle to build a brand new world in a new place. What would you say to them?
There's a line, I just had an event with my judge, who I clerked for yesterday, and there's a line that she responded with when I told her I had been undocumented. for the very first time. And she said, secrets, they have so much power, don't they? And secrets are what keep you on the run, or what keep you looking over your shoulder in fear of being found out. This imposed need to keep a secret on the undocumented population, that was my experience. But like I said, all of us have these secrets that we feel that we need to keep because there is something inherently unacceptable about us. And that's how secrets strip individuals of their power, because they believe that there's something that just cannot be seen. And to reclaim that power back from shame is what I sought to do with this book, Beautiful Country. And finally airing everything out that I did not dare to speak of or recognize or acknowledge has been the most liberating and terrifying thing I've ever done. But I can't say it better than my father did when the book came out. He said, there is nothing we are afraid of now, because finally we have found a way to own our truths. And when you can own yourself and own your truth and everything that you are, and find a way to love yourself no matter what, there's nothing that anyone else can do to strip you of that power. And I feel incredibly privileged that I've been able to have the resources and the safety to do that, because there are people out there who, by virtue of their status or everything they are dealing with, domestic violence, poverty, that they are not yet able to find that ability to own their truths. But I do hope that my story gives hope to those out there that it is possible one day for them.
I think it will. At what point did you share it with your parents?
I was very cowardly. 6 months after my book deal, I still had not told.
What? You had already sold the book?
I sold the book, and I didn't tell my parents that I had written a book.
And let's just add, they live like 10 miles away.
And I saw them and I talked to them. I texted them every day, and finally my husband was like, you gotta tell them, because one day they're gonna walk down the street and it'll be in the window and they'll be like, what? And I said, it's really my mother's fault, because whenever I went to the library and
it's always the mother's fault.
Exactly. That's what I learned in therapy. No, whenever I went to the library, and back in the 90s, there weren't that many stories about immigrants or Asian Americans. And I said, where are our stories? My mother always said, you were going to write it one day. Well, be careful what you say, because she forgot, I guess. That I started working on this book because of that idea that she planted in me. So finally I found the courage to tell them. It was December 2020, and it was a 5-act play in the vein of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, where we just kind of cycled around emotions. And pretty much the first thing that my mother said when I told them was, you want the whole world to know what an awful mother I was? And I had never stopped to consider what her feelings were about those years. I had never imagined that it would be guilt, that she would be taking on the weight of systemic barriers and injustices and putting it on her shoulder and blaming herself, as mothers are wont to do, of course. It makes perfect sense. And then all three of us got to talking, and my father said, no, it's not your fault, to my mother. It's my fault. If it weren't for me, we wouldn't even have come here. And then I said, well, it's my fault because I played all these pranks and lied a lot and caused all these problems and needed food, and so you had no choice but to take on these jobs. And we came to realize that by not talking about it, we were kind of each siloing our own shame and guilt and burden. And together we had this amnesty and safety to recognize that none of us blamed one another. And it was incredibly freeing to be able to air out all that anger and sadness and pain and at the very bottom, joy and appreciation. But again, I could not show them the book.
Yes, that's act 1 when you told them. What about act 3 when you gave them the book?
At the end of the very long night, my dad was like, great, so now can we read it? And I was like, no, you can't. And he's like, why not? And I was like, well, I don't have it. My editor has it. And of course I had
the only copy.
Of course I had it on my phone, I had it on my computer. And he's like, oh, okay, that makes sense because the book doesn't exist yet. So I was able to lie to them for a little bit. And the reason I lied was that there was this countdown clock in me. And part of me was still afraid that when the book came out, somehow there would be a reason to deport us again, even though we were still documented. I was, again, have been a lawyer for many years and knew rationally that that was not the case. But that age-old fear, that emotional self, was still afraid. And I wanted to spare my parents the knowledge of the details that were in the book so that maybe they wouldn't live in that kind of fear. And I also knew that every time I thought about my parents reacting to this book, being out in the world, I felt this need and compulsion to delete everything. And so I selfishly also wanted to protect myself from reneging on my book deal and find the courage to send it out in the world, because it's not just my story. It is very much theirs, filtered through my eyes, certainly, but it is their story. And I just wanted to make sure that I did them justice and could see through it. So the day it finally came out, I presented them with the book.
Not till it came out?
Yeah. The afternoon of September 7th, which was when it came out, I gave them each a copy. And my mother opens it up and she immediately bursts into tears seeing my name on the cover. And my father flips to the very last page. I always read the last line of a book first, and apparently he does too. It's something
I
in our
do
DNA.
too.
Yeah, and it thankfully was the acknowledgement where I thanked my parents for giving me everything when they had nothing. And he read it out loud, and he's like, this is a great book. I like this book a lot. And then they said, we don't know if we'll be able to read it because those were really painful years for us. And we don't know if we can revisit it. But of course, curiosity got the best of them. And they did, in fact, read it. They stayed up all night reading it. And my father texted and then called and said, it felt like he was watching a movie, but he was in it. And he had erased so many of the good that he had done from his version of the movie. He had forgotten that he had saved up money to buy me a Tamagotchi that I really wanted. Forgotten that he went to all ends to make me laugh and play pranks on me. And so I think at the end he said it was a really restorative and healing experience for them. And my mother actually thanked me for sharing not just her experiences in sweatshops like this one, but also that of the other women in that room and in that sushi processing plant. And she sees now why, she said, the story needed to be out there and that it's really not our story. And I agree with that. It was really not for us that I wrote it, but for everyone out there who might still be struggling with years similar to the ones that are recounted in this book.
What made you end it at 12 and not keep going until, through high school and into adulthood?
For me, the book was always going to end when it did, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone because I wanted to focus on this concept of beautiful country, which is the Chinese word for America, and this duality of what America can be for immigrants, and new immigrants in particular. Both beautiful and at times very not beautiful. And after age 12, things changed thematically for me, for my identity and my exploration and my needs and the things that I was grappling with. And really, I didn't think of this book as being about me. So why would it follow me my whole life, right? It's about a very specific experience and a specific window into that experience. So I wanted to narrow it so I could bring to life the details of the sweatshop, for instance, and how my mother sat hunched over the sewing machine for hours at a time, and the smell of freshly steamed rice as it wafted through the other smells of garment and flies and sweat in the room. So had I expanded the focus to my entire life, I think it would have been a very long and detailed book and not as interesting. I wanted to keep the focus very much on the people who are so rarely seen in our society.
I loved that. I think I might have said this to you before, but I don't usually love reading about kids. I tend to rush through the memoir till it gets to the part where the person's 20 years old. And I felt like your focus on those years really made everything so vivid and so detailed, and I loved that. I thought it was so smart. Tell us what you're working on now. I was hoping that you might be working on the second volume of your memoir, but I think you're not.
I'm working on a novel about Asian American women working in the what's called big law, the major, giant corporate law firms in America, and it's set in New York City. Very loosely based on my adult life, but informed by a lot of stories and experiences that I've seen, that my friends and people I've known have lived, and I kind of needed a palate cleanser. And I wanted to turn to something a little bit less heavy and serious and be able to write comic scenes, but also explore, again, an area that is not often looked at in our society. When we think of corporate lawyers, we typically think of white men in these white shoe firms, and the experience of women and people of color are very rarely explored. So I am having a lot of fun with it, but a lot of people have asked me if I would be willing to write a second memoir, and at first my answer was no. This one is it really felt like slicing off my heart and throwing it off a building. And so I didn't know if I could do that again, but now that some time has passed, I could see myself doing that again. I just need to spend some time understanding the subsequent years, because I want to make sure that I have something important to say and not have it just to be a recounting of events.
First an observation, then a question. Most people do not turn to the stories of big law as a palate cleanser. Let's just acknowledge that. But I can't wait to read it. And the question is, in all of your travels and events and talking about this book, which you do so beautifully, is there one area of the book or one question that you always hope somebody will ask that doesn't come up as often?
Yes. It has been asked a very small amount of times. I think when you write a memoir and on a topic like this, the art of the project often gets elided. And I spent a lot of time crafting the framing and the voice and the use of pinyin, in that it was very much a creative and artistic expression as much as it was an recounting, I guess, of those experiences. I really wanted readers to feel like they were almost boarding a train of my experience and being able to look out the windows as I saw things. And part of that was the use of pinyin Chinese early in the book and how it seeped out. I wanted readers to have an experience of what it was like to develop fluency in a second language and to learn idioms and become Americanized almost in the way that you perceive the world and thought about the world. So as much as in the beginning of the book, I view things from my height, which is much lower and can't see above countertops, later in the book, not only am I taller and more mature, but I'm much more Americanized and in many ways assimilated, whether that's good or not. And often I'm disappointed when I think that gets a little bit ignored in the conversation.
I'm glad I asked that question, and I'm glad that you gave that answer, because I will say, I wrote a review of this book, and the story is so was so astounding and moving to me that I felt like I only focused on the story, but not the, I don't use this word lightly, not the poetry of it and the really, really careful way it's put together, almost like when you pick up a beautiful coat and you look inside and you see how the seams are all stitched together. As a reviewer, I always look at, I kind of examine how a book is assembled and how the language moves the story forward. And in Beautiful Country, I really felt, I think it's easy for that part of the conversation to get lost because the story itself, the train is hurtling forward on the tracks so quickly, but you do it with such a sense of mastery that I definitely noticed and absolutely loved. I wanted to ask you how your relationship with the term and the title, Beautiful Country, has changed over the years.
This was not the original title
for
the manuscript. It was, I'm embarrassed of it now, it was Girl in the Shadows was the working title for this book. And back then that was Girl in whatever was very popular.
It was very in.
In publishing. And we wanted a cleaner and tighter title, and my agent and I both went back and came up with a list of options, and Beautiful Country was on both of our lists. And so that was what we went with on submission. But at the time I was like, I don't know. I feel like we could do better. This is not the right title.
Oh, I love it.
Which is so strange. And as time passed, I'm thinking, how could there have been any other title for this book? There is no other option for this book because it so represents in just 2 words.
Yeah.
The possibility that lives in immigrants' dreams and hopes when they board a train, a bus, a plane, a boat to get here, and also highlights the many ways in which the reality they come to find falls so far short of that.
Do you still feel like your reality is fallen short, or do you feel like you're in a place, I guess we sort of covered this, that you never could have imagined?
So I wrote a piece on the American Dream when the book first came out. I can't remember, I think it was in Harper's Bazaar. This idea of the American Dream that my parents still very much carry, and they say, real acceptance and belonging in America is not possible for us, and that's fine because our daughter will find it. And I so wanted to prove my dad right, that if I got all these gold stars and jumped through these hoops of speaking English perfectly, of going to the right schools, of passing the bar, of standing up in the courtroom, of becoming naturalized, that I would be accepted. And that is true in many pockets across this beautiful country. That is very much true. But there are other pockets where no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try to prove my loyalty, I will never be American to certain people. I will never be accepted by virtue of how I look and who I am. It reminds me of that segment of Japanese American soldiers who fought for America in World War II, and they had to prove their loyalty and patriotism time and time again with their bodies and their sweat and blood, and they came home to find still rejection. And I'm not doing anything near that level of sacrifice. But that feeling of disillusionment, I do grapple with still. My father is the most patriotic person I've ever met. He loves America, and yet he walks on the street in fear of being attacked because he looks Chinese, because he looks Asian. And yet he's still able to harbor this dream of America. And I, in some ways, envy that, and he reminds me of what could be, and I draw a lot of faith from him. But I'm sad to say that I don't have those rose-colored glasses anymore, and I have let go of that vision of the American dream.
This is a very hard time to hold onto that vision, I think. I know. do you think that there's, how do you think the experience of a family moving from China to New York today would be different than it was in 1994?
I hope and know there are more resources available for those new immigrants. I think the policy discussions that happen on a higher level with regard to public resources have shifted such that there is a recognition of new immigrants and the needs that they might have. There's a recognition of undocumented immigrants and their fear, for instance, of lining up for free food or provisions that where they're afraid to be asked for their documents. I think there's a lot more work left. The poorest segment of New Yorkers are Asian Americans, and that is just completely erased by this model minority myth. That there are undocumented Asian immigrants in this country is news to a lot of people. I've talked to senators who didn't know that. I've talked to just everyday Americans who said, oh, we thought they were all Mexican. No, undocumented immigrants come in all colors. And I think our society uses this myth, this idea of the docile, submissive Asian American who follows all the rules to kind of erase the reality of so many, not just the poor Asian Americans, but those of all colors and races and social economic class. And so I hope that with more voices from our community, and it sounds like there are so many, and I'm just so inspired to be in their company, that we can start to change the narrative, because until we find more representation in the news, in the media, in political discussions, we will never be fully humanized and seen as another American deserving to be here.
Do you strike me as somebody who's not afraid to grab the mic in the best way, but do you get tired of being a spokesperson?
It's exhausting. I've been in countless auditoriums, courtrooms, conference rooms, schools,
bookstores,
where I am the only voice belonging to a person who looks like me. And so there's a lot of weight that comes with that. And I cannot possibly speak for everyone who looks like me because our stories are so different.
Of course.
We are all people. We are all dimensional. Each person deserves to be their own voice. And until that stage is accessible for more people of different shades and colors and experiences, I have to do what I can to represent all of us. So it's an immense privilege, but yes, it is exhausting in a way that a white man stepping onto stage does not have to grapple with.
Do you still feel that words and books are the skeleton key that opens all the doors?
They are power. They are the key. I don't know where I would be, first and foremost, if I didn't have access to the public library. If I didn't land in New York City with its wealth of public resources, as I mentioned in my book, with the ability to walk or take the subway to another library if the book I wanted about Claudia Kishi was not at this branch. That is such a profound privilege that I just didn't even recognize until I got to know immigrants who moved to places that were more far-flung and did not have access to those stories. The ability to understand our lives, the ability to change the narrative of our lives is the key to self-empowerment and collective action. As I say, the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves mean absolutely everything.
This is a very basic question, but what role did, say, TV and movies play in showing you the whole picture of this country? Were they as meaningful, and music, were they as meaningful as books?
They gave me an access to belonging more than anything else. I got to see what it was like to celebrate Thanksgiving with a giant turkey on the table and in a big suburban house. And I got to play at, kind of knowing what that was like. And than being able to listen to songs that everyone else had access to, like Usher back in the day, and the Backstreet Boys, who to this day are my #1 favorite band.
Really?
Yes. I stand the Backstreet Boys, and I do not apologize.
There's no shame in it.
I Want It That Way is my all-time favorite song. So yeah, it gave me this key to the milieu that people my age across the country kind of were subject to, and gave me this ability to bond with people, and gave me the sense that maybe I did belong in some way, because I Want It That Way, and so did the kid next to me.
Do you think if your parents were moving to thinking about moving to a different country right now, they would still pick the U.S.?
I asked them this recently, and my father said yes.
Wow.
Every single time, yes.
Wow.
There is no country like America. He has this faith in this.
He is an optimist.
Yeah, as much as he calls himself a pessimist, he has this faith in this democratic experiment that we're living in, that we're seeing the throes of. And he believes that America will come out on the right side of justice. And that faith gives me hope. I don't often have that faith when I look at our history and the route our country has taken thus far, but I remain hopeful, because there is something about America, and specifically about New York City, that is home to me in a way that no land or place ever will be, and I can't quite understand it, and I can't quite understand my love and devotion to it, but it's there just as much as it's so there with my father. So I hope that he is right, and I join forces with every other author and lawyer out there in making sure that we push this country in that direction.
There's another rail of power in addition to being a writer and a lawyer, which I think of as two of the most powerful rails. And you know what I'm going to say, the third one is politics. Do you ever think about going that route?
I've been asked that at a few events, and I've reflected on it a lot. And based on what I've been able to see, I've had a few classmates from law school who've taken that route. Of course, I'm sure you have. My stance is that until I can see a way to maintain my sense of integrity and engage in politics, I will not take that route. And currently I do not see a way of maintaining my unique sense of integrity and going into politics, which necessarily requires compromise and bending in ways that I just currently do not feel comfortable doing. But maybe there is a possibility. I leave that door open.
What about a judicial path?
I dreamed of being a Supreme Court justice as a kid. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the reason I went into law.
Yeah.
But I think, having worked in law for so long, that part of my frustration with litigation and lawyering is that it takes forever for the cases to get to the courts. It's almost corrective justice. And so I see litigation as a Band-Aid on an existing wound, and writing as curing the body from the inside, which
love that.
Meeting the wound on both ends, I think, is what I need to be doing. And I'm not sure that I can be a justice and still do the writing work that I so love doing. So, I mean, it was my biggest dream. And again, I leave that door open, because I do think it is a very pure part of the law where you can kind of live in your integrity and rule the way that you believe is right. But life is long.
It is, and especially now, I feel like we're really starting to, even those of us who didn't go to law school, are starting to understand the power of judges.
Absolutely.
Hopefully for better, knock wood. I think we have some questions from viewers. So let's hear them.
Yes, so the chat has been filled with people, I think, who have been making their own connections, and I think it's just been, so it's been for just seeing the connections people are making in the chat. Also, it makes me think about the connections that I've been hearing throughout this such a moving conversation too, the stories we share in this garment factory and the stories of the Wang family. So thank you both so much. A lot of the questions got answered throughout the conversation. You guys asked excellent questions. But one that did come up was, I think going back to your point of, we don't hear very much about Asian American, the undocumented. And what has been kind of the reaction or kind of some of the people who've come up to you and spoken to you from the Asian American undocumented community?
I mean, I don't know why I'm surprised, but I was surprised when people came up and said, I thought I was the only one. Because I thought I was the only one. And so when many of us get together and say, we thought we were the only ones, and what life could have looked like if we had found each other or found each other's stories, we can't even begin to imagine. So being able to engage in that community and in that sisterhood in many ways, because many of us are women, and talk about the ways in which I think we felt that society gaslit us into thinking we didn't exist, and that there was singularly something wrong with us because we were the only one, and the problem was with us, has been incredibly healing and empowering going forward, knowing that we are not alone, and when we stand and share our stories, it is not just for each of us, but for all of us.
I'm interjecting with one more question. Have you had kids from your elementary school come forward and say, I didn't know this about you, but I too was undocumented at that time?
Not specifically from my elementary school. I have connected with kids from my elementary school who have said certain things about teachers that we had, and just, we didn't know that about each other. I have shockingly had people from my law school come forward and tell me that. And to imagine that I was sitting elbow to elbow with someone at Yale Law School, ashamed of our undocumented past, and then thinking of all the work that we could have done together had we had the safety to be able to commune in that shared history, makes me so regret the time lost. But
secrets.
Yeah, secrets.
But they're dangerous.
It's never too late.
No.
And so I'm so excited to be able to find those people from law school and college. And I'm sure there were people in my elementary school who struggled with the same experience, who I've just not yet been able to connect one-to-one.
Actually, maybe building off of that to a degree, we work a lot here at the Tenement Museum with students in the local community. PS 130 is a school we work with often, and part of the work we do is helping them kind of choose an object as a window into their family's story and sharing stories, and the power that comes with a class knowing each other and knowing a little bit more about where each of those students come from. Yeah. Do you have advice for young people who are trying to write their family story or kind of go down this path of starting to document their family story that you would share as kind of a final question from the audience?
I have so much, and also probably not enough. The best advice I can offer is for each person to trust their instincts. They're engaging in that storytelling for a reason, and everything that they have been through in life has equipped them to tell that particular story. And I would say that there's so much messaging in our society of the acceptable ways of telling stories, what stories need to be heard and what stories the audience just does not have interest in. And I would say you do not owe it to anyone to tell your story any set way. You do not owe it to anyone to tell your story at any set time. That story is in you and it lives in you. And if you need 2 extra years of therapy to percolate it, then by all means go for it. But I do encourage them to continue on that path of finding their story and telling it, because if nothing else, it has been so liberating for me and my family to be able to have these experiences down on the page. And I just know that once those stories are out there in the world, they can only inspire and connect others.
I feel that is a perfect beat to end on. I love that. I totally agree. And Thank you so much for talking to me. This was incredibly moving, and to be able to read a book that moved me as deeply as Beautiful Country did, and then to sit down with its author is an honor.
And I'm
so thank you.
The honor is all mine. I'm such a huge fan of yours, Liz, and all of those such high praise that you offered me in my book. Just the fact that you would be willing to spend this time with me just means the absolute world to me. This is a night I will always remember.
I will too. Thank you.